That rusted wreck isn't worth $500, the CEO said with a laugh. Then why are you still looking at it? The single dad replied. Nobody had an answer for that. The Saturday auction yard outside Tulsa buzzed with the sound of diesel engines, auctioneers, and casual mockery. Rows of forgotten vehicles sat beneath the bright Oklahoma sun, their faded paint and cracked glass telling stories most people no longer cared to hear. Men in expensive boots walked between the lots with coffee cups in hand. Investors studied clipboards. Collectors searched for hidden treasures. And near the back fence, where the least desirable inventory had been pushed away from public attention, sat a battered 1967 Mustang Fastback covered in rust, dust, and decades of neglect. Most people barely glanced at it. Wyatt Bennett couldn't stop staring. His weathered pickup truck rolled slowly into the gravel lot, coughing once before settling into silence. The truck was almost as tired as its owner. Wyatt stepped out and adjusted the brim of his old baseball cap. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of a man who had survived disappointment without allowing it to harden him. His denim shirt bore faint grease stains from yesterday's work. His boots showed years of honest labor. Beside him climbed down a smiling 10-year-old girl with bright eyes and a braid hanging over one shoulder. You really think it's here? Sophie asked. Wyatt nodded. If the listing was accurate. And if it isn't? She asked. Then we spent a Saturday together. Sophie grinned. That's still a win. Wyatt smiled back. Those moments mattered more than he ever admitted. Since losing his wife 8 years earlier, every choice he made revolved around protecting that smile. They walked through the rows of vehicles until they reached the Mustang. The closer Wyatt got, the more interested he became. The body was rough. The interior looked destroyed. The engine compartment was buried beneath years of neglect. Yet something about the proportions seemed wrong. Or perhaps right. Wyatt crouched beside the front wheel and brushed dirt away with his fingers. His expression changed slightly. Not excitement. Recognition. Dad, Sophie asked. What is it? Wyatt looked at the faded metal for several seconds. Maybe nothing. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't nothing. At the center pavilion, the auction began. Bidders gathered beneath large ceiling fans while the auctioneer worked through dozens of vehicles. Prices rose and fell. Applause occasionally followed a sale. Then the Mustang appeared on the screen. A few people chuckled immediately. One investor laughed outright. Who dragged that thing out of a swamp? Another joked. More laughter followed. Then a woman's voice rose above the crowd. Calm, confident, sharp. That car belongs in a crusher. Heads turned automatically. Victoria Sterling had arrived. CEO of Sterling Automotive. One of the most recognizable executives in the region. Elegant without trying. Intelligent enough to command every room she entered. She glanced toward the screen and shook her head. The scrap value is probably higher than the restoration value. Several bidders nodded in agreement. Then the auctioneer opened the bidding. Silence followed. Nobody wanted it. Nobody except Wyatt. 500, he said. The room turned. Victoria noticed him immediately. A working-class father in a faded shirt. Not exactly the profile of a serious collector. You're bidding on that? She asked. Wyatt met her gaze calmly. Looks that way. A few people laughed again. Victoria folded her arms. You know restoration costs more than dreams, right? Sophie looked down. Wyatt simply smiled. Good thing I'm not buying dreams. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold. $500. The crowd moved on almost instantly. But Victoria continued watching him. Something about his confidence bothered her. Most people who bought broken things carried hope. Wyatt carried certainty. As the crowd dispersed, Wyatt walked back toward the Mustang. The afternoon sunlight reflected off the rusted body panels. The car looked tired, forgotten, almost defeated. Sophie slipped her hand into his. Do you really think it can be fixed? She asked softly. Wyatt looked across the long hood and smiled. I think somebody gave up on it before they understood what it really was. Neither of them noticed Victoria standing several yards away, watching, curious despite herself. Because while everyone else had seen a worthless wreck, Wyatt Bennett had seen something entirely different. And buried somewhere beneath decades of rust and silence, the old Mustang was hiding a secret that would soon change all of their lives. Most people would have driven the car straight to a scrapyard. Wyatt Bennett drove it home. The old Mustang rattled slightly on the trailer behind his pickup as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Oklahoma highway. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing through the rear window at the rusted shell following them. For several miles, neither of them spoke. The hum of worn tires filled the silence. Finally, Sophie smiled. "You have that look again." Wyatt kept his eyes on the road. "What look?" "The one you get when your brain is solving a puzzle." A faint grin appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe it is a puzzle." Sophie nodded as though that confirmed everything. She had inherited her mother's ability to trust people before evidence existed. Wyatt admired that about her. Sometimes he even borrowed a little of it for himself. Their garage sat at the edge of town behind a modest white house with peeling paint and a front porch that needed repair. Nothing about the property suggested success. The mailbox leaned slightly to one side. The fence showed years of weather. The garage roof carried patches from 3 different repairs. Yet inside that building lived something far more valuable than appearances. It held discipline, persistence, and memories. Wyatt lowered the trailer ramp and slowly rolled the Mustang inside. Dust floated through shafts of evening sunlight cutting between the wooden beams overhead. Old tools lined the walls. Shelves held carefully labeled parts collected over decades. Every wrench hung exactly where it belonged. Every drawer had a purpose. Sophie walked around the car while Wyatt opened the hood. "Still think it can be fixed?" she asked. Wyatt studied the engine compartment. "Everything can be fixed. Even people?" Sophie asked quietly. Wyatt paused. Questions like that always arrived without warning. He looked at his daughter and smiled gently. "Sometimes they just take longer." Sophie seemed satisfied with the answer. She wandered toward the workbench while Wyatt continued inspecting the vehicle. Piece by piece, he examined the frame, suspension, body panels, and engine. To anyone else, it looked hopeless. To him, it looked familiar. The smell of old metal and machine oil brought back memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. 20 years earlier, Wyatt Bennett had not worked in a small-town garage. He had walked through research facilities in Detroit where engineers discussed innovation instead of survival. He had once been considered one of the brightest automotive designers in his division. His ideas had appeared in prototypes. Executives had listened when he spoke. Reporters had asked questions. Recruiters had made offers. Back then, his future seemed limitless. Then life changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough each year to redirect the road beneath his feet. His wife passed away after a sudden illness. Opportunities lost their meaning. Ambition lost its voice. Promotions became distractions. Awards collected dust. Eventually, he left everything behind. The industry moved forward without him. Wyatt never complained. He simply chose Sophie. Every day, every time. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts. Headlights swept across the garage entrance. A black luxury SUV slowed on the road before continuing past the property. Wyatt barely noticed. Several miles away, however, the driver was still thinking about him. Victoria Sterling sat in the back seat reviewing reports on a tablet. Yet her attention kept drifting elsewhere. "Something bothering you?" her assistant asked. Victoria closed the file. "That man from the auction. The one who bought the Mustang?" "Yes." Her assistant laughed softly. "You were right. It is junk." Victoria looked out the window. "Maybe." The answer surprised even her. Back in the garage, Wyatt wiped years of grime from a small identification plate hidden beneath layers of corrosion. His expression changed instantly. Calm became focused. Focus became disbelief. He grabbed a flashlight and examined the numbers again. Once, twice, 3 times. Sophie noticed immediately. "Dad." Wyatt did not answer right away. He slowly sat down on a nearby stool. The garage grew quiet except for the ticking of cooling metal. "What is it?" Sophie asked. Wyatt stared at the plate for several seconds. Then he looked at the Mustang. Not as a wreck, not as a project, but as something far more important. "I knew something felt wrong," he whispered. Sophie stepped closer. "Wrong good or wrong bad?" Wyatt smiled slowly. "Very good." He ran his fingers across the identification number one final time. Because buried beneath decades of rust sat something nobody at that auction had recognized. Not the collectors, not the investors, not even Victoria Sterling. And for the first time since bringing the car home, Wyatt understood exactly why he had felt so certain when everyone else had laughed. The next morning, Wyatt woke before sunrise. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirping of birds outside the kitchen window. He poured himself a cup of coffee and carried it into the garage. The air smelled faintly of dust, motor oil, and old memories. The Mustang sat exactly where he had left it, bathed in pale blue morning light filtering through the high windows. For a long moment, he simply stood there. Then he reached into his pocket and unfolded the small piece of paper where he had copied the identification number the night before. He compared it again. Every digit matched. Every code aligned. The feeling in his chest was not excitement. It was respect. You knew, did you not? He whispered toward the car. The Mustang offered only silence. Yet somehow that silence felt like an answer. By 7 o'clock, Sophie entered the garage carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches wrapped in paper towels. You have not moved, have you? She asked. Wyatt accepted the sandwich and smiled. I moved enough to make coffee. Sophie laughed. That means no. She climbed onto a stool beside him while he carefully removed another panel from the vehicle. Beneath years of corrosion and neglect, more clues began revealing themselves. Small details, engineering marks, prototype references, features that should not have existed on a production model. Wyatt's heartbeat remained steady, but his mind raced. Decades ago, certain experimental designs had been tested and then abandoned. Most disappeared forever. A few became legends among collectors. Very few ever resurfaced. Sophie noticed the growing pile of notes on the workbench. You are writing a lot. Because I do not trust memory. Is it really special? Wyatt paused. If I am right, it is far more than special. Later that afternoon, word of the auction purchase had already spread through town. At Miller's Diner, several locals gathered around a corner booth discussing the situation with amusement. $500 down the drain. That thing will never run again. Maybe he just likes collecting rust. Chuckles followed each comment. Nobody meant harm. Small towns often filled silence with opinions. Unfortunately, opinions traveled faster than facts. Meanwhile, 30 miles away, Victoria Sterling sat inside a glass conference room overlooking downtown Tulsa. Executives reviewed quarterly projections while charts glowed across multiple screens. Normally, Victoria commanded complete attention. Today, she found herself distracted. Victoria, one board member asked, "Are you with us?" She blinked. Yes. Continue. The presentation resumed, but her thoughts wandered back to the auction yard. Back to Wyatt Bennett. Back to the certainty in his voice. After the meeting ended, her assistant approached. I received an invitation from the Oklahoma Heritage Auto Expo. Victoria accepted the folder. The annual exhibition? Yes. 30 days from now. Victoria nodded absent-mindedly. Then another thought appeared. Find out whether Wyatt Bennett registered a vehicle. Her assistant looked surprised. You think he plans to enter? Victoria closed the folder. I think people who speak with that kind of confidence usually have a reason. Back in the garage, Wyatt worked through the evening. Bolts loosened. Components emerged. Dust settled across the concrete floor. Piece by piece, the car surrendered its secrets. The sound of tools echoed beneath the wooden rafters. Sophie sat nearby doing homework while occasionally handing him wrenches. It felt less like restoration and more like archaeology. Just before sunset, Wyatt removed a damaged interior panel hidden behind the rear seating area. Something slid free and landed softly on the floor. Both froze. Wyatt crouched immediately. Sophie stepped closer. What is that? She whispered. Wyatt carefully lifted a weathered leather tube no larger than a flashlight case. The material had aged badly, but the contents remained protected. Slowly he opened one end. Several rolled documents emerged. Old, fragile, forgotten. Wyatt unrolled the first sheet across the workbench. His eyes widened instantly. Sophie looked between the paper and her father. Dad. Wyatt did not answer. Another document followed. Then another. Engineering sketches covered the pages. Handwritten notes filled the margins. Official markings appeared near the corners. The garage fell completely silent. Even the evening wind outside seemed to stop. Sophie stared at the drawings. Are those blueprints? Wyatt swallowed carefully. Yes. For this car. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Not just for this car. He looked across the pages again, realizing the full significance of what lay before him. Because hidden inside the vehicle for decades was not merely documentation. It was the original development record of a project that automotive historians had spent years searching for and never found. Wyatt barely slept that night. The blueprints remained spread across the workbench long after Sophie had gone to bed. A single lamp cast a warm circle of light across the aging pages while the rest of the garage faded into darkness. Outside, crickets sang beneath the Oklahoma stars. Inside, history sat quietly on a sheet of worn plywood. Wyatt studied every note, every signature, every engineering revision. The handwriting belonged to people he recognized immediately. Some of those names had become legends within the automotive world. Others had disappeared from public memory decades ago. Yet all of them pointed toward the same conclusion. This was not an ordinary prototype. This was a missing development vehicle from one of the most ambitious performance programs of its era. For years, collectors had debated whether it still existed. Most experts believed it had been destroyed. Wyatt slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You hid well," he whispered toward the Mustang. The next morning, he contacted an old friend he had not spoken with in years. By noon, a video call connected from Detroit. Gray-haired automotive historian Leonard Hayes appeared on the screen. "Wyatt Bennett," Leonard said with a grin. "You vanished for a decade and suddenly call me out of nowhere. Good to see you too." Leonard adjusted his glasses. "What did you find?" Wyatt rotated the camera toward the blueprints. The smile vanished from Leonard's face almost instantly. He leaned closer. Then closer still. "No," he whispered. Wyatt said nothing. Leonard stared for nearly 30 seconds. "Where did you get these?" "Inside a car." "Impossible." Wyatt slowly revealed the identification plate photographs. Leonard examined each image carefully. The historian's expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "Wyatt," he finally said, "do you understand what you are looking at?" "I have a pretty good idea." Leonard nodded slowly. "If those documents are authentic, collectors have been searching for this project for over 40 years. Silence filled the call. Then Leonard smiled. "Only you would find something like this in a junk auction." Back in town, restoration work began immediately. Wyatt approached the project with patience rather than excitement. Every component received careful inspection. Every measurement was documented. Every repair followed the original engineering notes. Sophie watched the transformation begin one piece at a time. The garage became their world. School during the day, restoration at night. Weekends disappeared beneath toolboxes, manuals, and coffee cups. The old Mustang slowly surrendered decades of neglect. Rusted parts were removed. Hidden details emerged. Original markings reappeared beneath layers of corrosion. Several times Sophie caught her father smiling at the car when he thought nobody was watching. Those moments made her happiest. For years she had seen him work hard. Now she was watching him come alive. 3 days later, news reached Victoria Sterling through an unexpected source. Leonard Hayes had mentioned an unusual discovery during a private collectors forum. He never revealed the owner. He never revealed the location. But he described enough details to spark attention throughout the automotive community. Victoria read the discussion during a lunch meeting. Her eyes narrowed immediately. "Interesting?" her assistant asked. Victoria closed the tablet. "Possibly. The prototype story? Maybe." She stared through the conference room windows. "Find out whether Wyatt Bennett has been buying restoration parts." Her assistant laughed softly. "You are really curious about him." Victoria did not answer. Because curiosity was only part of the truth. Something else bothered her. Every report she read seemed to increase the value of the car she had mocked. Meanwhile, Wyatt remained focused on the work itself. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the garage roof, Sophie sat on a stool watching him rebuild part of the suspension system. "Dad, why did you stop designing cars?" The wrench paused in his hand. Questions about the past rarely arrived without weight. Sophie waited patiently. Wyatt finally sat beside her. The garage smelled of metal and fresh paint. Rainwater drummed gently overhead. "Because some dreams belong to one season of your life," he said. Sophie frowned. "That sounds sad." Wyatt smiled softly. "Not sad, just true. Do you miss it?" For several seconds, he studied the Mustang. Then he looked at his daughter. "Sometimes." Sophie nodded. "I think it misses you too." Wyatt laughed quietly. "Who?" "The car world." He shook his head. "I do not think the car world notices people like me anymore." Sophie pointed toward the Mustang. "Then why does it feel like this car was waiting for you?" The question lingered in the air long after she spoke it. Wyatt turned back toward the vehicle, toward the blueprints, toward the second chance he never expected to find. Because deep down he was beginning to realize something extraordinary. He had not merely discovered a forgotten piece of automotive history. He had stumbled into a race against time. The Oklahoma Heritage Auto Expo was now less than 4 weeks away, and for the first time, he was seriously considering entering a car that the world believed should not even exist. The calendar on the garage wall seemed to move faster with every passing day. 26 days remained until the Oklahoma Heritage Auto Expo. Then 25. Then 24. Wyatt barely noticed the numbers changing because every hour was consumed by work. The Mustang no longer looked abandoned. Sections of the body had been restored. Components had been rebuilt. Hidden engineering details were slowly returning to life exactly as the original blueprints intended. Yet the closer he came to the finish line, the more challenges appeared. One evening, Sophie entered the garage carrying 2 bottles of water. "You forgot dinner again," she said. Wyatt glanced at the clock and blinked. "It is almost 9. 9:15. Sophie handed him a bottle. "You are losing track of time." Wyatt laughed softly. "That usually means I am making progress." Sophie looked at the car and smiled. Even beneath primer and unfinished panels, the Mustang was beginning to reveal its character. It no longer resembled a forgotten relic. It looked like something waiting to be remembered. Across the state, however, interest in the project continued growing. Collectors talked. Historians speculated. Online forums debated whether rumors about a surviving prototype could possibly be true. Nobody knew the full story. Nobody knew the owner. But curiosity spread quickly. One afternoon, Wyatt received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Bennett?" a polished voice asked. "Speaking. My client would like to discuss purchasing your vehicle." Wyatt continued sanding a panel. "It is not for sale. You have not heard the offer." "I do not need to." A brief silence followed. "The offer is $50,000. Sophie nearly dropped the box she was carrying. Wyatt did not even pause his work. "Still not for sale." The caller sounded genuinely surprised. Most people would consider that a generous amount. Wyatt smiled faintly. Most people are welcome to sell their own cars. He ended the call and returned to work. Sophie stared at him. $50,000? Wyatt nodded. "That is a lot of money. We could fix the roof." "Yes." "Pay off bills." "Probably." "Buy air conditioning that actually works." Wyatt laughed. "That would be nice." Sophie folded her arms. "Then why say no?" Wyatt set down the sanding block. The late afternoon sun streamed through the garage windows, casting long golden beams across the concrete floor. Because sometimes the right thing is worth more than the easy thing. Sophie considered that answer carefully before nodding. Mom would have liked that. The smile on Wyatt's face grew softer. She probably would have. 2 days later, another offer arrived. Then another. The numbers climbed steadily. 70,000. 80,000. One collector even offered to purchase the blueprints separately. Wyatt refused every proposal. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling found herself becoming increasingly frustrated. During a strategy meeting, she caught herself reading restoration updates instead of reviewing company reports. "You are doing it again," her assistant said. Victoria looked up. "Doing what?" "Thinking about the mechanic." Victoria sighed. "He is not a mechanic." "Then what is he?" The question lingered. Victoria realized she did not know the answer. She only knew that every expert who examined the available evidence seemed impressed by Wyatt Bennett. More than impressed. Respectful. That bothered her because she had dismissed him within seconds of meeting him. Back at the garage, pressure continued building. Some restoration parts could not be purchased. They had to be fabricated by hand. Several original components no longer existed anywhere in the country. Wyatt spent long nights machining replacement pieces using measurements from the blueprints. The sound of tools echoed past midnight. Coffee cups multiplied across the workbench. Sleep became optional. One rainy evening, Sophie sat nearby, finishing homework, while Wyatt assembled part of the engine. "Dad," she asked. What happens if you do not finish in time?" Wyatt tightened a bolt carefully. "Then I do not finish." "That does not bother you." He looked at her and smiled. "The goal is not to impress people, Sophie." "Then what is it?" Wyatt glanced toward the Mustang. The rain tapped gently against the roof overhead. The garage smelled of fresh paint and machine oil. "To honor the work that came before me." Sophie smiled. "That sounds like something a designer would say." Wyatt froze for half a second before laughing quietly. Then he returned to the engine. Because with less than 3 weeks remaining, he was no longer simply restoring a car. He was racing against time itself, and for the first time since the project began, Even Wyatt Bennett was not completely certain he could win. 17 days remained until the Oklahoma Heritage Auto Expo. The number was written in black marker on a calendar hanging beside the garage door. Sophie crossed off another square before leaving for school and circled the new date with dramatic seriousness. 17, she announced. No pressure. Wyatt smiled over the rim of his coffee mug. Thank you for the reminder. You are welcome. She pointed toward the Mustang. Try not to invent extra work today. After she left, the garage returned to its familiar quiet rhythm. The morning sun filtered through dusty windows. A radio played softly in the background. Metal clicked against metal as Wyatt continued rebuilding the car piece by piece. Progress was visible everywhere. The suspension had been completed. Much of the body restoration was finished. Several rare components were functioning again for the first time in decades. Yet one problem remained. The engine. More specifically, a highly specialized component described in the original blueprints, but missing from the vehicle itself. Wyatt searched every database he could access. He called suppliers, contacted collectors, reached out to former engineers. Nothing. The part had effectively vanished from history. By late afternoon, frustration settled heavily across the garage. Papers covered the workbench. Measurements filled notebooks. Dead ends multiplied. Wyatt rubbed his eyes and stared at the blueprints again. Somewhere there had to be an answer. The problem was time. Every day spent searching was a day not spent building. Meanwhile, in downtown Tulsa, Victoria Sterling found herself reviewing the same reports for a second time. Not because the reports mattered, because her attention did not. Finally, she pushed the folder aside. Tell me something, she said to her assistant. About Wyatt Bennett? The assistant asked immediately. Victoria sighed. Am I that predictable? Lately? Yes. Victoria leaned back in her chair. What did he do before opening a garage? Her assistant opened a tablet. That is actually interesting. Victoria looked up. Go on. Before disappearing from the industry, Wyatt Bennett worked for several major automotive development programs. Victoria's expression changed slightly. Development, design, and engineering. The assistant scrolled further. Awards, patents, prototype projects. Victoria slowly sat forward. You are telling me the man restoring a car in a small-town garage was once designing vehicles. Apparently very successful ones. Silence settled over the office. For the first time since the auction, Victoria felt something she had not expected. Regret. Back in the garage, the situation grew worse before it improved. 3 days later, Wyatt still had no solution. He spent hours comparing specifications and searching archives. Nothing matched. Nothing fit. One evening, he finally pushed away from the workbench and sat down heavily on a stool. The garage felt different that night. Quieter. Colder somehow. Sophie noticed immediately. She entered carrying dinner and stopped. You have the face. Wyatt looked up. The face. The face you make when something is wrong and you pretend it is not. He laughed softly despite himself. I did not know I had one of those. Sophie placed the food on the table. You do. She sat beside him. How bad? Wyatt hesitated. The part one need might not exist anymore. Sophie glanced toward the Mustang. That sounds inconvenient. Very. Impossible. Wyatt considered the question carefully. Then he shook his head. No, Sophie smiled. Good. Good. You always told me impossible and difficult are different things. Wyatt stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed quietly. I did say that. A lot. The garage fell silent again. Outside, evening clouds drifted across the sky, while distant thunder rolled far beyond town. Sophie looked toward the Mustang. Do you remember what you told me when I was learning multiplication? Wyatt groaned. Please do not quote me. Too late. She grinned. You said people quit right before they discover they were closer than they thought. Wyatt shook his head. I really need to stop giving speeches. No, Sophie said softly. You need to start listening to them. After she went inside, Wyatt remained alone in the garage. The storm finally arrived. Rain tapped against the roof. Wind whispered around the walls. He studied the blueprints one more time before preparing to quit for the night. Then something caught his eye. A notation hidden within the margins of one engineering revision. Tiny. Easy to miss. His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer. Then closer still. The note referenced a supplier code. An obsolete supplier code. Wyatt immediately reached for a folder containing historical records. Pages turned rapidly. Rain continued falling outside. His heartbeat quickened. 3 minutes later he found it. A company. Long closed. But not completely gone. One warehouse remained active under a different name nearly 200 miles away. Wyatt stared at the information in disbelief. Then he smiled. Not because the problem was solved. Because for the first time in days, there was hope. And sometimes hope was all a determined man needed to keep moving forward. The next morning Wyatt was on the road before sunrise. A thermos of coffee sat in the cup holder. The old pickup hummed steadily along a two-lane highway stretching across the Oklahoma countryside. Sophie had insisted on coming. She sat beside him with a notebook in her lap and enough snacks to survive a week. How far again? She asked. About 200 miles. For one part. Wyatt smiled. Sometimes one part changes everything. Golden light slowly spilled across the fields as they drove east. The warehouse they were searching for barely existed anymore. The original supplier had disappeared decades earlier. Ownership had changed. Records had vanished. Buildings had been sold. Yet one location remained active under a different company name. Whether the missing component still existed inside was another question entirely. By late morning they arrived. The warehouse stood at the edge of an industrial district surrounded by chain-link fences and aging brick buildings. Nothing about it suggested hidden treasures. The sign above the entrance had faded from years of sun and weather. Sophie stared at it. This is the place. I hope so. Inside, rows of shelves stretched into the distance. Dust-coated forgotten inventory. The smell of cardboard, metal, and machine oil filled the air. A gray-haired manager greeted them politely. Can I help you? Wyatt showed him the supplier code from the blueprint. The man adjusted his glasses. I have not seen one of those in years. Do the records still exist? Wyatt asked. The manager laughed softly. Maybe, if we are lucky. For nearly 2 hours they searched through archived inventories. Boxes were opened. Catalogs were examined. Old computer systems were consulted. Several times it seemed hopeless. Then the manager stopped walking. He stared at a shelf near the back wall. Well, he said quietly. That is interesting. Wyatt followed his gaze. A small crate sat untouched beneath layers of dust. The label matched the code from the blueprint exactly. Nobody spoke. The manager carefully lowered the crate and opened it. Inside rested a single component wrapped in aging protective paper. Wyatt stared at it in disbelief. Sophie looked between the part and her father. Is that it? Wyatt nodded slowly. That is it. The manager shook his head. 40 years. Sophie smiled. Looks like it was waiting for us. The drive home felt different. Hope filled the truck. For the first time since the restoration began, Wyatt could see a clear path forward. The missing piece was no longer missing. The project could finally be completed according to the original design. Meanwhile, in Tulsa, Victoria Sterling sat alone in her office reviewing information she had requested about Wyatt Bennett. The deeper she looked, the more uncomfortable she became. Patent records, engineering awards, historical project credits, professional recommendations. One document after another painted a picture completely different from the man she thought she had met. You found all this in one afternoon? She asked her assistant. Most of it was public. Victoria leaned back slowly. Why did he leave? Nobody seems to know. Victoria stared through the glass walls of her office. Maybe we never asked the right questions. Several days later she made a decision. On a cool Thursday afternoon, a black SUV turned onto the road leading toward Wyatt's property. The vehicle stopped outside the garage. Victoria stepped out alone. The sound of tools echoed from inside. She hesitated briefly before walking toward the open door. Wyatt was focused on installing the newly discovered component and did not notice her immediately. Sophie did. Dad, she whispered. Wyatt turned. For a moment neither spoke. Victoria glanced around the garage. The transformation stunned her. The vehicle she remembered from the auction no longer existed. In its place stood something extraordinary. Not finished, but close. Very close. Hello, Mr. Bennett, she said. Wyatt set down a wrench. Ms. Sterling. An awkward silence followed. Sophie wisely disappeared into the house. Victoria walked slowly around the car. Fresh paint gleamed beneath the lights. Restored panels reflected the afternoon sun. The craftsmanship was impossible to ignore. I owe you an apology, she said finally. Wyatt looked genuinely surprised. For what? Victoria laughed softly. You know exactly for what. Wyatt considered her words. Then he smiled. People make assumptions. I made several. That happens too. Victoria looked at him carefully. Why did you never tell anyone who you were? Wyatt wiped his hands on a cloth. Because who I was is not the same thing as who I am. The answer lingered between them. Quiet. Honest. Unexpected. Victoria glanced toward the Mustang again. You are going to finish it, are you not? Wyatt looked at the calendar on the wall. 11 days remained. Then he looked back at the car. I think we finally have a chance. Victoria nodded slowly. For the first time since the auction, she was no longer looking at a struggling single father trying to save an old car. She was looking at a man whose quiet dignity had rebuilt something far more valuable than metal. And as she stood there in the fading afternoon light, she realized she wanted to see how the story ended just as much as everyone else. The final week arrived faster than anyone expected. 7 days became 5. 5 became 3. Then suddenly, only one square remained on the calendar hanging beside the garage door. Sophie stared at it every morning, as if watching the countdown itself could somehow help. The Mustang stood complete beneath the bright lights of the workshop. The deep metallic finish reflected every tool, every beam, every memory trapped within those walls. Weeks earlier it had looked forgotten. Now it looked legendary. Wyatt circled the car slowly one last time. His hands rested lightly on the smooth bodywork. Every panel matched the original blueprints. Every mechanical system functioned exactly as intended. Nothing had been rushed. Nothing had been compromised. Sophie appeared beside him carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. So, she asked softly, how does it feel? Wyatt accepted the cup. Strange. Strange good or strange bad? He smiled. Strange grateful. Sophie nodded. That sounds like a dad answer. Early the next morning, they loaded the Mustang into an enclosed trailer and began the drive toward Tulsa. The Oklahoma Heritage Auto Expo occupied an enormous convention center near downtown. Collectors from across the country attended every year. Rare vehicles filled exhibition halls. Historians, journalists, investors, and enthusiasts crowded every aisle. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. When Wyatt arrived, few people recognized him, but many recognized the registration number attached to his vehicle. Rumors had circulated for weeks. The missing prototype, the forgotten blueprints, the mysterious owner. Conversations followed him wherever he walked. That is him, the garage owner, the one who found the prototype. Wyatt ignored the whispers. He had not come for attention. He had come to finish what he started. Inside the exhibition hall, bright lights reflected across polished floors. Classic cars gleamed beneath display banners. Expensive restorations occupied premium spaces. Crowds moved from exhibit to exhibit. Yet one section remained covered by a large black curtain. Wyatt's section. The organizers had arranged a special unveiling after confirming the historical significance of the vehicle. As opening time approached, attendance swelled. Reporters gathered. Cameras appeared. Historians took seats near the front. Even Leonard Hayes had flown in from Detroit. Victoria Sterling arrived shortly afterward. She wore a simple navy blazer and carried none of the authority she usually displayed in boardrooms. Today she looked less like a chief executive and more like someone genuinely invested in another person's success. Sophie spotted her first and waved. Victoria smiled and waved back. Nervous? She asked Wyatt quietly. A little. Good. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. Good. Victoria laughed softly. It means you still care. Minutes later, the presentation began. The event host stepped onto the stage and welcomed the crowd. Brief remarks followed. Historical context was provided. The story of the missing prototype was explained. Interest grew with every sentence. Then the host looked toward Wyatt. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, for the first time in more than 4 decades. The curtain began to move. The hall grew silent. Not quieter. Silent. Hundreds of conversations vanished at once. The black fabric slowly pulled aside. Light struck polished metal. The Mustang emerged. For several seconds nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The car seemed almost unreal beneath the exhibition lighting. Elegant. Precise. Powerful. Every line reflected craftsmanship and history. Every detail honored the original engineers who created it. Sophie looked around and saw exactly what her father had promised without ever saying aloud. Respect. Pure respect. One historian removed his glasses and stared. Another slowly shook his head in disbelief. Cameras flashed. Yet even the photographers seemed hesitant to break the moment. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. She remembered the rusted shell at the auction. She remembered laughing. She remembered believing she understood its value. Now she realized she had never understood the value of the man standing beside it. Applause began somewhere near the back. Then another section joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall stood. The sound rolled through the building like thunder. Wyatt lowered his head briefly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Sophie squeezed his hand. "Dad," she whispered. "Look." He looked up. Hundreds of people stood applauding not just a car, but the patience, vision, and quiet strength that had brought it back to life. And as the applause continued beneath the bright convention lights, an auction coordinator quietly approached the organizers with unexpected news. Multiple collectors had already submitted purchase requests. The bidding, if approved, would begin before the day was over. The applause lingered long after the unveiling ended. People continued gathering around the display, studying details, asking questions, taking photographs, and sharing theories about the remarkable journey that had brought the prototype back into the light. Wyatt answered politely when approached, but he never seemed entirely comfortable with the attention. He stood beside the vehicle with the same quiet posture he had carried into the auction yard weeks earlier. The difference was not the man. The difference was that people finally saw him clearly. Late that afternoon, event organizers converted one section of the exhibition hall into a private collector auction. Interest had exceeded every expectation. Bidders arrived from across the country. Some represented museums. Others represented private collections. Several had spent decades searching for automotive history exactly like this. Sophie sat beside Wyatt in the front row. Her feet barely touched the floor. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "I am already proud of you." Wyatt smiled. "That makes two of us." The auctioneer stepped forward. The room gradually settled into silence. Bright lights reflected off polished wood and polished metal alike. The prototype remained visible through the glass display area behind the stage. It almost seemed to be watching. The bidding opened immediately. $60,000. A paddle lifted. $70,000. Another followed. $80,000. The numbers climbed faster than anyone expected. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Collectors who rarely competed openly now entered the contest. $90,000. $95,000. $100,000. The room grew still. Sophie looked at her father with wide eyes. Wyatt simply exhaled slowly. The amount itself mattered less than what it represented. Respect, recognition, validation of every late night and every difficult choice. Yet the bidding was not finished. Another paddle rose. $105,000. Then another. $110,000. The auction continued for several more rounds before finally slowing. The final bid settled at $120,000. The gavel came down. A sharp crack echoed through the room. Applause followed immediately. Sophie threw her arms around her father. Wyatt hugged her tightly. Neither spoke for several seconds. They did not need to. Across the room, Victoria Sterling watched quietly. She smiled as the crowd congratulated him. There was no trace of amusement now. No trace of judgment. Only admiration. Later that evening, the exhibition hall began emptying. Display lights dimmed. Vendors packed equipment. Visitors drifted toward parking garages and hotel lobbies. The noise of the day gradually faded into a peaceful hush. Wyatt stood alone beside the now-sold vehicle one final time. His hand rested lightly on the roof. "You did all right," he whispered. "Dad," Sophie called from nearby. "Coming." Before he could step away, another voice stopped him. "Wyatt." He turned. Victoria stood a few feet away. The crowd had disappeared around them. Only a handful of staff remained. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria smiled. "I spent weeks thinking you restored a car." Wyatt folded his hands in his pockets. "And I was wrong." He raised an eyebrow. "Again?" Victoria laughed softly. "Again." The hall lights reflected gently across the polished floor between them. "You restored something much bigger," she continued. "Your reputation?" Wyatt suggested. Victoria shook her head. "No. Your belief that what you loved still mattered." Silence settled comfortably between them. It was not awkward. It was honest. Sophie watched from a distance with a knowing smile. Victoria glanced toward the vehicle one last time. "You know," she said, "most people would have sold it the moment someone offered $50,000. Wyatt smiled. "Most people have better roofs than I do." That earned another laugh. Then Victoria became serious. "The world needs more people who see possibilities instead of problems." Wyatt looked toward Sophie. I learned that from a good teacher. Sophie pretended not to hear while smiling even wider. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the Tulsa skyline. Golden light poured through the convention center windows, bathing everything in warm amber tones. The long journey was finally over. The debts would be easier. The future would be brighter. Yet the greatest reward had nothing to do with money. Weeks earlier, people had seen a rusted wreck and a struggling father. They had laughed. They had judged. They had moved on. Wyatt Bennett had simply looked deeper. Because character often works that way. It does not shout. It does not demand attention. It quietly keeps building, believing, and doing the right thing until one day the world finally notices. As father and daughter walked toward the parking lot beneath the fading evening sky, Victoria joined them. Their conversation drifted